Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carl Ulrich. I'm a partner at Sebaly, Shillito, and Dyer, a law firm in Dayton, Ohio, Westchester, Ohio, and Eaton, Ohio. Welcome to our presentation today. Our topic for today is drug, alcohol, and other pre-employment screening issues. My co-presenter, as always today, is Matt Messersmith, who is the president and owner of Signet Screening, a background check and testing company down here in Westchester, Ohio. As I said, today we're going to be talking about drug, alcohol, and other pre-employment screening for employers. And as we go through our presentation today, we want to have cover a few key goals. First of all, the fundamental question for a lot of employers these days is, why do we do pre-employment screening in the first place? Why are we concerned about screening applicants, particularly in an environment where it's sometimes hard to find labor, hard to find qualified, or any employees for that matter? So why do it? We'll cover some of the basic information on why pre-employment screening makes good business sense for most employers. I want to talk a little bit about the legal issues today surrounding pre-employment screening. We also want to cover common types of pre-employment screening. I want to talk a little bit about COVID testing and pre-employment as well, because this is a topic now that we are on the heels at the tail end of a 2-year ongoing pandemic. As we're hopefully at least emerging from that, we want to talk a little bit about what that's going to look like going forward in terms of pre-employment screening. The COVID issue is not going away, and so we have to be concerned about that when we talk about applicants, talk to applicants and vet applicants. What substances are being screened for? Matt's going to go into some detail about that. How do we prevent fraud? How to identify fraud in the drug and alcohol screening process in particular. And we also want to talk to some extent about some basic best practices when using pre-employment drug and alcohol and other screening. So those are the goals we want to cover today. So let's jump right in here. So why do we do pre-employment screening? Well, just to give you some sense of the scope of the issue, the problem of substance abuse in the workplace is one of the key reasons we do pre-employment screening. Again, drug and alcohol screening in particular. An interesting statistic that came about as a result of a survey by the National Institute on Drug Abuse. By the way, NIDA, N-I-D-A, is a arm of the Department of Health and Human Services. So it's a federal government agency whose charge in part is to gather information about drug abuse in the U.S. and the U.S. economy, the impact on employers in particular, among many other things. And so they've gathered some very interesting statistics about substance abuse in the workplace. And one of the neatest statistics that came out of the recent survey they did was that 40% of all workplace fatalities, 40%, that's almost half of all workplace fatalities, involve some substance abuse, either drug or alcohol involvement. Now, that's a pretty staggering statistic when you think about it. Another interesting statistic, even probably more relevant for most employers, is that 47%, almost exactly half of all workplace injuries are in some way related to substance abuse. So when you look at those statistics collectively, you begin to see that substances play a key role in health and safety in the workplace. Now, obviously, oftentimes in the pre-employment context, when you announce to applicants that you're going to be doing drug testing pre-employment or alcohol testing pre-employment, they're going to self-select out of the application process. Frequently, they're going to see the writing on the wall, and they may remove themselves from the application process. So there's a deterrent aspect to drug and alcohol screening in hiring. But as I said, health and safety is really the primary concern. One of the things we also have to consider too is the workers' compensation impact. We talked a little bit about the relationship between workplace injuries and drug and alcohol abuse, but Another interesting statistic out of this NIDA survey, which I think employers should consider, is that substance abusers are roughly 3.5 times more likely to be involved in a workplace accident. 3.5 times more likely to be involved in a workplace accident. And that is, again, one of many reasons why you might want to consider screening out those applicants before you get them into the workplace itself. There are other statistics which I want to share with you out of this NIDA study. Substance abusers are but roughly 2.5 times more likely to have 8 or more absences during any work year. So absence is tied to substance abuse, as one might expect, right? Substance abusers are 2.2 times more likely to seek an early dismissal from the workplace. In other words, leave work early, perhaps with or without prior notice. 3 times more likely to report late to work. And interestingly enough, 5 times more likely to file a claim. Interesting to think about that in the context of the 40% and the 47% we talked about earlier. But substance abusers have a much higher rate of claims filing, and that doesn't necessarily mean that all those claims are properly compensable. So there is a direct correlation, at least in these statistics, between substance abuse and these kinds of items. You know, one of the big pushbacks I think a lot of employers get or want to advance for not doing pre-employment screening or any drug screening in the workplace is the difficulty in finding workers. The employment challenges that are faced, particularly now on the heels of the pandemic. We've seen some labor shortages all across the U.S. economy. And one of the arguments is, well, if we do drug testing, if we do pre-employment drug testing or any kind of drug testing, we're going to have a harder time keeping our workforce in place. Well, for those who are making that argument, I want to throw another statistic at you, which I think is also worth considering. Substance abusers, according to this NIDA study, and this is pre-pandemic, are more likely to have 3 or more employers within the last year. Substance abusers are more likely to have 3 or more employers within the last calendar or within the last year-long period, meaning that employee turnover is directly correlates to, or potentially correlates to, substance abuse. Substance abusers more likely turn over their jobs. And again, instinctively, we would understand why that would be the case. And the reality is that as a result of the pandemic, we've seen abuse rates increase, not decrease. And so the facts are that as you get involved with substance abuse, you're less likely to be able to hang on to a job. And that is a reason why employers may still want to consider screening out for those kinds of employees before they get into the workplace to avoid the very type of employee turnover that they're concerned about. All right, we want to talk a little bit about the various legally mandated pre-employment screening topics. The Department of Transportation, as many of you are aware, is a federal regulatory body that generally regulates motor carriers, air and rail carriers, public transportation. It also addresses the pipeline and maritime industries. But the Department of Transportation mandates certain drug screening, particularly in the pre-employment context. And even though it's limited to certain industries, the Department of Transportation rules are often used as models for other industries as a basis for what to test for, how to test, the procedures utilized. Matt's going to talk a little bit more about some of those procedures, but the Department of Transportation rules require pre-employment testing. They also say that drug tests in the pre-employment or any other context are urine tests only. In other words, there are no instant tests allowed under the Department of Transportation rules. That's not the case in all contexts, but that is the case for the Department of Transportation, urine only. Alcohol tests, which are not generally included in the pre-employment context, if they are requested, can be breath or saliva tests, but a confirming test, which is required under the DOT procedures, has to be a breath-only test. So again, there are certain specific DOT rules that apply in these industries. Again, those may be utilized as guidelines by other industries as a starting point. Keep in mind also that I'm aware of 15 states that have drug-free safety programs, essentially programs which allow for employers to receive a rebate or a discount on workers' compensation premiums if they do certain things, including, in many cases, drug testing, both pre-employment, post-employment, post-accident, that kind of testing. 15 states that I'm aware of have those discount programs, and many of those programs will result in a substantial savings if you do testing the right way. Ohio is one of those states. The Ohio Drug-Free Safety Program is a specific program that allows two different levels of workers' compensation premium reductions. The basic level is a 4% reduction. The advanced level under the DFSP requirements is a 7% reduction. And the requirements for each of those levels are a little different, but in both cases, pre-employment drug and alcohol screening is required in order to qualify for those, one of the several requirements in order to qualify for both of those levels of discount. So there, again, it's not a required thing that Ohio employers or any other state employers participate in that program. But if you do choose to seek those discounts, you do have to comply with the testing requirements in order to qualify. I want to also just sort of summarize real quickly the drug and alcohol screening under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Federal law and many state analogs say that the current use of illegal substances is not a disability. So, you know, if you have an employee who's a substance abuser, they're not necessarily protected under the ADA. Now, alcoholism, the condition of alcoholism is a disability, but inebriation in the workplace is not. You can be an alcoholic, you're protected by the law, but that does not give you the right to come to work under the influence of alcohol. Fine distinction, perhaps, but that's an important distinction for purposes of regulating the workplace. Pre-employment drug and alcohol screening is not a prohibited medical test and exam under the ADA, since drug and alcohol abuse and being under the influence in the workplace is not a protected status for the most part. Medical tests and exams, both pre-employment and post-employment, are not considered ADA prohibited. So the other thing I want to mention too is as we emerge from this COVID nightmare that we've experienced over the last 2 years, a lot of people are going to be suffering from long haul COVID symptoms. People who've had COVID and are still suffering from periodic symptoms. They may have a number of long-term physical symptoms that are going to restrict or inhibit their ability to do the job, or may affect their life in other ways. Those long-haul COVID symptoms are potentially disabilities under the ADA, which means that pre-employment COVID testing is risky. I know a lot of employers say, hey, we'd love to be able to COVID test pre-employment because obviously we want to know if we've got somebody who's going to be a COVID risk and infect other people in the workplace potentially if they've, but pre-employment COVID testing and any inquiries related to COVID history are considered and will be considered, in my opinion, prohibited inquiries under the ADA. So we have to draw a distinction now between drug and alcohol screening pre-employment and COVID testing and COVID screening pre-employment. Those are not the same things, and they're treated differently and will be treated differently under the law. Keep in mind, too, that there are other laws affecting how we do pre-employment screening, drug and alcohol, or any other screening for that matter. You're going to apply a standard, you're going to apply a practice, you do it consistently across the board. You don't treat people differently based upon prohibited status, certainly, but protected status, certainly. But whatever you do in this category, you want to do consistently across an employee group. There are also considerations of invasion of privacy and defamation if you delve too deeply into medical history, or you delve too deeply into personal history in the process of pre-employment screening. You could run the risk of seeing issues pop up in that area as well. So consistency is key. Drug and alcohol screening generally not regulated, and but there are certain aspects to that which Matt is going to talk about some more here in a little bit. Just a real quick update on the state regulation. There are certain states that there's certain jurisdictions, not necessarily states, that do have blanket prohibitions on pre-employment testing. The most obvious one that I can remember is the New York City ordinances that prohibit pre-employment testing outright. Most of those are local, not necessarily state or federal, but they are in place. And so if you are in a major metropolitan area, for example, you have to make sure that you consider not only the state rules, but also potentially the local ordinances. As I said, New York City is one of those examples of places where there's a blanket prohibition for pre-employment drug and alcohol testing. Limited restrictions in places like California. Has to be job related and consistent with business necessity. There are certain requirements under state employment, government employment, but for the most part, those limited restrictions do exist in California law and have to be considered if you are going to be employing pre-employment testing there. Other state-specific rules vary. Certain states actually require pre-employment testing for certain types of positions. Other states create an optional environment, and other states don't regulate it at all. So it's impossible for us in the time provided to go through all the state rules here because they vary so widely. The point of all of this, of course, is just keep in mind that there are differences from state to state. So if you have if you're an employer with multiple jurisdictions to consider, you do have to think about the differences from one jurisdiction to the next. And marijuana laws are like that. Certain states allow recreational use, certain states allow only medical use, some states don't allow any marijuana usage. And testing for marijuana, whether it's allowed or regulated in some other way, depends to some extent on that state's approach toward recreational marijuana use or medical marijuana use in general. So keep in mind, again, very widely differing state rules regarding testing for marijuana as one of the controlled substances in the process. All right, that's a very quick overview. I'm going to turn it over to Matt now to talk about some of the nuts and bolts of this area.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I know Carl had hit on some of these as far as why we do this. Obviously, productivity is much lower when somebody is an abuser, absenteeism, more accidents. I found a statistic where 44% of employees who abuse drugs have sold to other employees. So whether it be at your job site or office, or outside the workplace, they are selling drugs as well. Theft is another one that I wanted to throw in there. A lot of times people with addictions will actually steal from the workplace to fuel that addiction. And obviously, as Carl had mentioned before, a lot of this can lead to excessive turnover, which led to his statistic of somebody who has 3 or more jobs in the past year. There's a lot of turnover. They're going from job to job. So I want to get into some of the specifics now when we talk about pre-employment screening. Those of you that have been on our past webinars know we've talked about saliva, urine, and hair. Urine is by far the most common for pre-employment drug screening. It's very flexible. We have the ability to add and remove drugs. We can have a very long list of drugs, or we can shorten it up to whatever you as the customer would want. Can screen for street and prescription drugs. It's very cost effective. 24-hour turnaround time on the instant test for negatives. That is for negatives only. If it is a positive, it then must be sent on. And remember, when we're doing pre-employment drug screening, we're not looking for impairment like we discussed it in our post-accident and reasonable suspicion drug screen. You're looking for previous use. Just wanted to list, I know in our past presentations, I had talked about how different drugs are in someone's system for different amounts of time. The list on the left is going to give you an idea of roughly how long certain drugs are in someone's system. You can go to LabCorp, you can go to Quest, you can go to a bunch of other sites, and these are estimates, okay? There's no hardcore fact that says if somebody's on amphetamines or methadone or methamphetamines or marijuana, how long it's in their system. These are estimates. The person's body mass, the metabolic rate, how often they are using the drug, the type of drug itself, all lead to how long that is in someone's system. The reason that the urine screen is used is it's very convenient. And I'm referring to sending someone to the lab, not doing them on site, which those of you that have done that know it's not real convenient to do urine screening yourself at your facility. We're partnered with LabCorp and Quest. We've got thousands of locations all over the country, and we actually even have third-party locations as well for those more remote areas. Your cities are going to have 5 to 10, depending upon how big the city is. You're going to have labs downtown and in the surrounding suburbs to make it convenient for your applicant to choose which lab to go to. No appointment is necessary when we use LabCorp and Quest, which is another convenience for your applicant. It's important that this process be as smooth as possible. They can simply schedule and head into the lab, and then they can do their drug screen. Hopefully you're using an electronic scheduling. At Signet, we have an application which basically the person is emailed a link, and based on their zip code, it's going to pull up all the different locations around them. It's going to let them choose which one they want to go to. And basically what happens is they are emailed a barcode that they could print out, or they could take it in on their phone. And when they walk into the lab, they just simply get that barcode scanned, and the lab knows what drug test they're running and where to send the results. I want to just give you an idea about what type of security is done at the lab. Most pre-employment drug screens are unobserved. There are some government positions, police officers and things like that where they have to be observed, but most of your pre-employments are going to be unobserved. The donor must bring an ID, a state-issued ID, to come in and verify that they say who they are, so that no one can go in and pretend to be somebody else. They have to remove all their jackets. They have to empty their pockets, okay? They have to walk into the restroom basically with no place to hide items. The restrooms will have no soap, no cleaning agents or other adulterants. There's no trash cans. Basically, it is a room with a toilet and a sink, and under the sink, there's no cabinetry or anything like that. They've even gone as far as to remove drop ceilings because if somebody goes in ahead of that person, in the past, people would put samples and stuff like that up in the ceiling and try to hide so that people could pass it off as their own sample. There is no running water. They're not allowed to flush the toilet, and the sink does not have a running water. When the person comes out of the restroom, the cup actually has a thermometer right on it that lets them know that it is the correct temperature. It's very difficult to have a device on you where you can actually keep that sample the proper temperature. A lot of times if somebody tries it, it's boiling hot or too cold, and the person wouldn't be alive if those were the actual temperatures. Once the person exits the screening room, they complete the chain of custody. If it is an instant test, there is the test is performed right there on site, not within the view of the donor. If the cup test or the instant test is presumptive positive, it is then sent on to the lab for further testing, okay? And then it goes through the entire MRO process if necessary. So if the person would have a prescription, the doctor would call and confirm that and get a copy of that prescription. So that brings us to the results. Don't assume, a lot of our clients, you're getting the pattern of getting drug screens back within 24 hours, and then all of a sudden you send somebody and it isn't back in 24 hours. You can't assume that it's going to be positive, because as I said before, if you are screening for prescription drugs, there will be, they might be on a prescription drug that they would have to talk to the MRO about. Once the MRO confirms that they do have a valid prescription, they would basically, the results would be returned as negative. You do not see that the doctor had a conversation with them about a drug. It just comes back as negative. So don't assume that results are positive if they're not coming back within that time frame. As with everything, please be consistent when you're doing your drug screens. Just like the background check, you don't want to pick and choose who you send to be drug screened. You want to make sure you provide advance notice to your applicants. As Carl said before, a lot of our clients will actually have out in the lobby a sign that talks about being drug screened, and a lot of people will come in for interviews, and when they see that sign, they'll just exit out. So it can save you some money. Make sure you're using licensed laboratories. Obviously, we're with Quest and LabCorp, which are licensed, and follow all the proper procedures. Have a written policy. As you saw, a lot of those drugs can be out of somebody's system relatively quickly. And if you're giving them multiple days, if you tell them on a Monday, hey, you need to have this done by the end of the week, and you're giving them 5 days, any drugs that they had in their system, marijuana maybe being an exception, could already be out of their system. So have a policy, make sure that you have something that says they need to have it completed in a certain amount of time. And as always, please follow the Fair Credit Reporting Act. I believe we're right at our time. Next month, we're going to be talking about an employer guide on, what you need to do to background screen. We're going to be talking about what documents you need, how long you need to keep those documents as far as retention, what needs to be done if you make an adverse decision. And that will be on April 13th from 12:30 to 1. And if there are not any questions, which I do not believe there are, we want to thank everybody for attending today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next presentation. Thank you.